Jesus tells a story. A business owner is going on a trip. She calls in 3 employees, entrusting each one with a part of her business. Upon her return, she calls them in again to see how they've fared. One has been creative, taken risks, and doubled his money. The second played a more conservative game. Remarkably, though, he's also doubled his money. The third knows now that he's in trouble. He hadn't lost anything, but he hadn't gained anything either. The first 2 get promotions. The third gets fired. You know the moral of this one. Don't be lazy, use your talents, add value, work as though God himself is your boss. But there's a couple of less obvious points here about work and about our claim to the profits of our labor. Of course, we don't have masters and servants anymore. Today, employers employ workers in exchange for a salary or a wage. What workers earn is theirs to keep and to use however they wish. That's not the type of relationship imagined in Jesus' parable. Now, I find slavery as reprehensible as you do. It's an illegitimate form of human relationship with an unspeakable history. And I can't pretend that I've got a way to tell this story that doesn't use the terms of master and servant. I just put that out there. Nevertheless, it's just worth registering Jesus' point. Servants belong to masters. They're there to advance the master's interests and to work for the master's profit. What they don't have is a right to what they produce. Now, the idea that we're God's servants might offend your intuitions, not least because it fails to capture the way that Scripture describes us as God's beloved children or as members of his body, and so on. What Jesus' story does help correct concerns the way that you and I sometimes talk about God as though God is in some way like us, a friend, a lover, a daddy, in terms that suggest we're somehow equals. Those metaphors aren't wrong. They're just analogies. And like any analogy, they risk misrepresenting what's being made analogical. In this case, they risk misrepresenting what Soren Kierkegaard calls the infinite qualitative distinction between God and creation. The idea can be seen in Paul in what he preaches to the Athenians in Acts, that in God we live and move and have our being. Or in his letter to the Colossians, that in Christ all things hold together. John's gospel says it too. All things came into being through him, and without him, nothing came into being. Or Psalm 24, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. You get the point. God's relation to the universe is wholly asymmetrical. There's an infinite qualitative distinction. So, while the metaphor of masters and servants isn't perfect, it does help express what we sometimes miss, that we exist on God's terms, that everything we have and everything that we are owes to him. And so while we're enjoined to add creatively to the value of creation through our work, as in Jesus' parable, what we add also belongs to God. And that ought to inform how we understand what we own. Of course, our belongings belong to us legally and practically, but they belong to us under the overarching reality of Christ's lordship. They're entrusted to us as custodians under God's direction. This becomes all the more clear in Jesus' next parable. Everyone is assembled. God is judging who's a member of the kingdom and who isn't. As the king declares who's in and who's out, an argument ensues. Many who thought they were insiders end up on the outside, and so they contest the selection criteria. It has to do with the themes that we've been considering in this series, with how we treat those at the bottom. How we treat them, says the king, determines our membership in the kingdom. That's a statement about how we're supposed to use our stuff. That Jesus tells these 2 parables in immediate succession is interesting. The ideas are connected. That as God's servants, we're expected to work hard, to add value, but also to utilize the profits of our labor, at least in part, to aid those needing food or housing or clothes or whatever. This is what the 4th century Bishop Basil of Caesarea has in mind when he inveighs against rich Christians. Why are you wealthy while the other man is poor? The bread that you hold back belongs to the hungry. The silver that you keep hidden in a safe, that belongs to the one in need. However many you could have provided for, so many are those that you wrong. Now, hold on a second. However many I could have provided for, that many I wrong? That raises some questions. One, I could provide for quite a few people, I expect, especially if I kept nothing for myself. Exactly how much am I being asked to give here? And second, perhaps more fundamentally, who actually counts as poor? I'll return to the first question in the next sessions, but let's just pause to answer a question we've not addressed so far. Precisely what do we mean when we talk about poverty? And how do we determine who's poor, especially in a rich, industrialized Western economy like the UK? I want to describe two approaches, not so much to commend one over the other, but to reveal some features of what it's like to be poor. Measuring poverty is typically calculated by determining what's required for a household to subsist, by taking an inventory of the cost of basic expenditures like rent, electricity, water, food, and so on. Add up the cost, and anyone making less counts as poor. This is the poverty line approach. It's where the statistics I've been quoting comes from, that 14.2 million people in the UK live below £17,500 per year. When the woman in the video explains how she can't cover her monthly expenditures and also buy the shoes that her boy needs, it's this that she's signaling. The poverty line is a really useful metric. It clarifies who most urgently needs aid, and it identifies the bare minimum level below which it's impossible to get by. But it doesn't tell you everything you might want to know. What it takes to cover your essential costs isn't the same as, say, measuring what's needed to live a decent life. The poverty line tells you what's needed to cover your bills, not what's needed to function in a way any reasonable person might deem acceptable. So, let's ask a different question. Not concerned with covering your basic expenditures, but with how many people live below a standard the rest of us would regard as unlivable. That's a different kind of question. To answer, we could conduct a survey, giving thousands of people a list itemizing all the things your life might include, covering everything from your bare essentials to the number of pillows on your bed, how many changes of clothes you have, or your TV license, your phone bill, even going for a drink down the pub with your mates. We'll ask people to identify only things without which they couldn't live their lives, things that they'd count intolerably bad if they didn't have, like, I could endure a lot, but I couldn't live without at least one hot meal per day. Or I could never live without a refrigerator, or if my bed had no sheets. We'll tally up the results, and we'll see what we get. Actually, you know what? Let's assume people are more resilient than they assume. They could probably endure more than they think. So let's discount what people describe as the acceptable minimum by, say, 25%. We'll call this the minimum income standard. It'll be higher than the poverty line, but it will reflect what most of us agree is needed to have a tolerable life in this country. You'll have guessed that this experiment has been run. For the last 5 years, in fact, Joseph Rowntree has been tracking poverty using precisely this metric. Measured against these standards, the poverty rate in the UK goes from 14.2 million to 18.7 million people. I tell you about the minimum income standard to highlight a problem that's sometimes hard to see, especially if you've never been poor yourself. That poverty is about more than having insufficient resources to cover your bills. It also means being deprived of a full human life, or at least the kind of life that you and I would accept as minimally livable. One thing this should tell you is that our poverty statistics reveal a lot about what those measuring think is important, that the experience of poverty actually isn't always captured in our methods of analysis. It should tell you something else too, this time having to do with the parable we were just discussing. You may be tempted to think that the lazy servant represents poor people. But I think these descriptions tell you that Jesus' parable can't actually be used in that way to criticize the poor. To see why, you need to imagine yourself in the sort of circumstances I've just described. Let me highlight two realities that you might not have considered. First, 16 million British have less than 100 pounds in savings. 60% of people in poverty have no savings at all. They have no buffer against emergency, which means that they're highly constrained in their ability to plan for the future. They can't plan for the future because they're stuck in a state of constant precarity. When circumstances turn bad, which they will, the effects are felt more profoundly and with greater impact. Contingencies that you and I might address easily, like the refrigerator breaking or needing to travel for a family funeral, require them to dip into their already insufficient funds. And that imposes greater hardship going forward. You live under constant stress, trying to catch up from the last catastrophe, stretching your resources all the more thinly, all while hoping that something else doesn't go wrong. And that makes you more vulnerable to future setbacks. It's like playing a game of snakes and ladders, except there are way more snakes than there are ladders. But just think how important future planning is for making forward progress in life. This suggests the second problem. You're limited in the ways that you can convert what few resources you do have into other life goods. It's a slightly difficult idea to capture, but it can come through using some examples. Like lacking enough to provide childcare means you can't take the free adult education courses down at the local college, or even on the internet really, even if it would help improve your employability. You just don't have the resources to capitalize on those opportunities. Or if you work, say, 70 hours a week just to cover your costs, you're not going to be able to spend time networking or exercising or participating in church groups or spending time with friends or having dinner with your family. Poverty prevents you from converting what you do have into benefits for improving your situation. You're held back, not only from your ability to plan for the future, but also for making the most of the few opportunities that do come your way. Let's return now to Jesus' parable. Compare the situation of the servants with that of the poor. In the relationship between the master and the servants, the master provides for the servants' basic needs. The poor don't have that provision. The servants aren't required to think about how to stretch their resources to get through difficulty. That's the master's job. The poor don't have any source of that kind of help. Not that I think that there's anything good about being a servant, simply to observe that the preconditions for the servant working to advance the master's interests is that the servant has no other responsibilities. His life necessities are covered. The poor lack those conditions, which suggests a couple conclusions. First, however we read Jesus' parable, it can't be used as a critique of the poor. It's not about how they fail to make good on their talents. The conditions the servants enjoy are precisely the conditions the poor lack. Or put differently, The poor are denied the form of life in which they'd be able to add to God's purposes. Certainly not in the way that's available to the servants, and certainly not in the way that's available to us. The second conclusion strengthens what I've been trying to say. If our hope is for the poor to put their talents to good use, to take up their place in the great task of improving the world, what's necessary is for God's servants, you and I, to mobilize the property God entrusts to us in precisely the way Jesus tells, providing those whose circumstances render them vulnerable and precarious with what they need. Otherwise, we leave them in a position like Tyler in the video, so desperate to live at a minimally decent life that the only viable option appears to be crime. Jesus teaches us that the church owes him a better option. But that means being generous with the resources God has entrusted to our stewardship, being satisfied with enough, giving of our surplus, and bringing them up to sufficiency.